today, special edition with Michael Anthony Alberta and his book, A Portrait of a Spymaster, the Renaissance Man. I'm very happy to be interviewing you today, or to be talking to you today, Michael.
Likewise, Raphael. Likewise.
Welcome to the
Thank
show.
you. Thank you. It's a pleasure. This is great. This is definitely the most popular show I've been on thus far, and I appreciate the platform. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and all thanks to our viewers, of course. However, as everyone knows, we don't go necessarily for the most famous individuals or ideas, but for the most interesting ones. So therefore, I'm particularly happy to be interviewing you. I can recommend to everyone, of course, all the links are in the descriptions, also to check out the recent interview you did with Arcane Dialogues, I believe, where you already delivered, I think, a very concise and great relatable summary, also for somebody who maybe is not that deep into alternative chronology yet, as some in the chat and our viewers very well may be. However, still, I'd kindly ask you to give us a brief introduction to you, first of all, and of course, to your work, to the extent that you'd like to share with us.
Sure. So my name is Michael Alberta. I'm originally from Miami, Florida. I'm now currently living in Colombia. I guess I'm a world traveler at this point. I've been to probably a dozen different countries now, and just enjoying my life. I do a lot of various things, mainly back end stuff. I have certain contracts dealing with online things, but yeah, on my free time, I love to research history. I love writing books and really diving into this one topic. This specific topic has really engaged me for upwards of a decade now. It took me roughly 5 years to write this book, but even 5 years before that, I was processing all of it. So and what it is essentially aspiring that I believe goes back to antiquity, and one of the provocateurs, I wouldn't say the founder, because it seems like it does go back before the 15th century, but the main character in the book is a gentleman by the name of Leon Battista Alberti, and he was a polymath. He was among the first, at least in terms of Renaissance Italy, before all the Ninja Turtles came about, there was Leon Battista Alberti. So Leonardo da Vinci was really studying this guy's work when he drew up the Vitruvian Man, and a plethora of other inventions. You could actually trace them back to the work of Alberti, specifically the Vitruvian Man. So Alberti is one of the best things he's known for contemporarily is his I guess rephrasing of Vitruvius. He uncovered the ancient documents in the 15th century when the Byzantines, during the fall of Constantinople, and there was a bunch of Greek knowledge that entered Florence, Italy. And as a result of that, there was all kind of inventions that started popping up. And this is the mainstream historical narrative. And we should probably get into that before we start to speculate, because Alberti is actually, he deserves a lot more credit than he gets. And this is just mainstream. For example, his work into optics is very interesting. So when you look into the camera and how we started taking pictures, and you look into his work with De Pictura, one of his first documents, and you see people that studied after him, you see the evolution of the actual camera come through Alberti. Now, granted, there's people before him and people after him as far as the mainstream historical narrative, but he played an integral part in that. Same thing with modern day computers. For example, when you look into the evolution of the computer, you see probably the precursor is the Enigma machine. And the Enigma machine is essentially an electronic polyalphabetic cipher. And Alberti is attributed to inventing the polyalphabetic cipher. Now, I speculate that he used these ciphers to encrypt knowledge for the Vatican. This is not mainstream knowledge. This is a speculation. And before I get too much into that, let's also concentrate on his work. In terms of language, if you actually study where the contemporary Italian language, I also lived in Italy for several years, where that language comes from, you can actually go back to the linguistic work of Alberti and specifically his stuff. What really blows my mind is Toscanelli, who studied under Alberti. Now, Toscanelli, they did work together with map making. And Alberti, he studied, was it geography at the time? It had to do with architecture, but at the time, it was the most related field for map making. So before we really understood that whole process. Alberti gave Toscanelli all kind of information, where Toscanelli is the one that gave the map to Columbus for the New World. Now, this is a mainstream, this is actual facts. And this is an integral part in my argument, because I argue that Alberti was actually born in Mesoamerica, specifically Mexico, under the name Nezahualcóyotl. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Specifically, the Voynich manuscript. So if you wanted to look up the Voynich manuscript, which is a whole thing, but you'll find that both gentlemen, number one, Nezahualcóyotl and Alberti both died and were born on the same day. They were artisans. They basically reflect each other, which I get into in my last podcast. But for a brief thing, you can see their timelines mirroring each other, and it's a little strange. And phenotypic, you can actually see they look very similar. Now, Nezahualcóyotl is attributed with being one of the major founders of the Aztec Empire. At the same time, there was a gentleman in the same hemisphere named Pachacuti who founded the Inca Empire. Now, I believe these are all the same guys, and it all relates to the Voynich manuscript and cryptology. You know, Alberti, the father of cryptology. First of all, I don't believe he was born in genuine 1408. Like I said, he was born in Mexico. His father was a high-ranking Toltec, and he was murdered in front of him. So I believe he fled back to Italy and came back as Pachacuti to conquer the land, this is before Columbus. Now, this all comes together through several things. Pachacuti is known for, because I'm jumping around here for your viewers, I really need to craft this a little better. And I'm really jumping into more, I really wanted to stick with Alberti's historical achievements, because he really does not get enough credit. I want you guys, if anything, to really look into him and understand the value that he brought. Because when people talk about the Renaissance man, they really fail to mention him. So anyway, back to Nezahualcóyotl, the Pachacuti connection. It all ties in through the Voynich manuscript, which has Mexican paints, literal paints that you can scientifically measure, do not come from Italy. However, you could also see that the paper and the parchment and certain other things that are made come from Italy. That's why they date the creation of the Voynich manuscript to the same place and time as Alberti published previous manuscript, which I don't remember the name right now off the top of my head. But it does set Alberti in the same place that it's speculated to have been authored. So that's also interesting. What's even more interesting is, like I said, this guy Pachacuti was a cryptographer. And cryptography, the only trace of cryptography in the Americas at the time was with this guy Pachacuti, who happens to share the same birthday and death date as Alberti. So that started shaking me up. But really, ultimately, I really started getting into this because of Anatoly Fomenko and his speculation that Alberti was, in fact, Vitruvius. And this is how I came to the conclusion that it's even possible that Da Vinci's physical drawing of the Vitruvian Man is actually Alberti himself. Which, again, these are all speculations, but there is no doubt about it that Da Vinci got the information that he needed to draw the Vitruvian Man from Alberti's work on Vitruvius. Long story short, I believe Alberti came back and initiated the Renaissance. Alberti was part of an international spy ring that his father was running at the time. And his father met the fate of the locals that he subverted, which is usually what happens to spies of this caliber. If we start looking into history, it does appear as though this is a reoccurring pattern. Now, is it a reoccurring pattern, or has history been folded in on the 15th century? So basically everything we're reading is phantom reflections of what happened within Alberti's lifetime. And I think it's a little bit of both. So back to Alberti and Nezaquatl. And if you have any questions, Raphael, please. I don't want to bulldoze.
No. This is great. Go on. The only thing, so I found Nezaquatl, of course, here we have Leon Battista Alberti. There was one more individual you mentioned, which I think I failed to look up so far.
That's Pachacuti.
How is that spelled?
Look at this for your viewers. Just look at this rendition of Nezaquatl, and then look at Alberti, and look at the depictions of Nezaquatl. You can't help but see that these. I mean, obviously, there's other depictions of Alberti that this is all. But for example, but anyway, also you can go back to Pachacuti. These guys did not look like Mexicans, and it actually says it. And if you look at Nezaquatl's page, he's an outsider. His father, these guys were outsiders. These guys were not. He died like Nezaquatl's father was killed by the Mexica, and the modern day Mexico is named after these people. But Nezaquatl in Mexico to this day is revered, which is that's a whole other issue. Nezaquatl's son was killed by Hernan Cortez. There's a lot of things that I believe that this agency actually either double-crossed or it's just part of their process. They're not really they're assets in a process that, there's no loyalty, so to speak. But anyway, back to Pachacuti Nezaquatl. So Pachacuti, that's Pachuti. There you go. If you type in, there he goes right there. Now, he's been on Ancient Aliens. A lot of people speculate about his, I don't think that these people were aliens or gods or anything. I think they were just intelligence agents. And they were part of a supranational organization that shared information that basically they were privy to knowledge that most people weren't. I don't think most people were literate. I mean, it's a proven fact. Most people were not literate in the 15th century. It wasn't until, decades and even centuries after the printing press that there was a collective knowledge of how to read. We don't really understand. We don't think about that. But this is mainstream. I have a lot of speculations. I listened to a gentleman on your channel, Ewing. He has a lot of valid points that validate a lot of my claims. And they're not really my claims. In all honesty, like I said, I got a lot of my stuff from Anatoly Fomenko. A lot of 80% of his stuff was incorporated into my theory. But he doesn't mention Pachacuti, Nezaquatl, the Voynich manuscript. That's kind of why I start off with this. And that's kind of why I start off with this in the book, because this is an interesting thing. And it's especially with the Voynich manuscript. People have been trying to crack this Voynich manuscript for hundreds of years. And there, as far as the mainstream, the people, no one knows how to crack it. Maybe people do know how to crack it, but they're not talking about it because maybe once they see what it says, they want to keep it a secret if possible. And maybe they have a vested interest to do so.
So there is one simple thing I would like to bring up. Also, this I learned through David Ewing Jr. because I wasn't properly aware of this. Are you familiar with this linotype machine, which I'm showing on screen right now? So this is apparently the modern variants of printing. And here it says, so this was created for texts from the late 19th century to the 1970s and 1980s. This is like an early variant of a typewriter. And why I'm bringing this up is because we are supposed to believe that all the ancient and medieval scripts and newspapers, or so many of them, and even books, were printed, sometimes not in small volume. I'm even thinking of, for example, the US with the Civil War, or Austria with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and many other places that supposedly had publications with very high circulation. However, if all you'd have is a Gutenberg press, and people may have seen what this looks like. Well, here it simply says printing press. Yeah, but that's accurate enough. Actually, at this museum, you can even find online videos, maybe even of exactly this guy showcasing how this type of printing works in a traditional Gutenberg printing press.
Oh,
And
look
it
at
is
that.
the thing is that it is a very fragile system. You need to change many pieces. You need to properly arrange the letters and everything. And what always had tripped me up, even before I knew anything about this, is if we look at, I'm even thinking now, just for fun, I'm thinking of De Bello Tartarico here. And we have the images, and hopefully, yes, exactly. We have the very first page. What do we see? First of all, of course, we see the nice Jesuit logo up front, which is always an interesting sign, right? But second of all, we have so many books that are supposedly medieval, but they are oftentimes printed in this perfectly spaced out, modern-looking font. And the question I have here, and from what I learned from David Young Jr., he seems to confirm many of these suspicions, which
Yes.
simply is that around the 1900s, whatever books may or may not have existed before, they were all collected in maybe even some sort of inquisition. And then the sanitized versions were being put out with or by using this modern type of, not the old Gutenberg printing press, but this linotype machine.
Huh.
So this is one of the bottlenecks I perceive in history, just in terms of printing capacities and possibilities, where it
Yeah.
very much looks like everything was collected. Who knows how much was burnt and hidden, and whatever was approved for the modern reset of the 20th century, 1900 something, was then re-released through these linotype machines. That is just my understanding. Since you brought up the printing.
Right. I mean, and it's interesting. The printing press also came from Germany. It came from Germany around the same time the German Rosicrucians came about. That's what is also an interesting fact, and how the Rosicrucians are so obsessed with history, and that ties into the Jesuits. Yeah, obviously, if you study occult for more than a couple hours, you run into the term Rosicrucian. So I don't need to go down that rabbit hole with your viewers, I don't think. But yeah, the printing press is one of those things where, and I do believe that the agency resets history, the historical narrative, periodically. I think this whole idea that's coming about right now, we call cancel culture. I think when that cancel culture reaches a threshold, they pull the lever, and they say, you know what, nobody's taking the history seriously. People are not learning from their past, and they're ignoring the truth, and we're gonna redo this whole thing and start over, and let's test another process. So yeah, I mean, and it sounds devious, but like hypothetically, if I had the power to be responsible for the entire planet, I would need some kind of device like this set up for a reset. I mean, how else would so I'm not saying that they're doing it with the best intentions, but you always have to kind of be empathetic to both the good guys and the bad guys, because you have to understand the bad guy, just so you, number one, can defeat them. Number two, maybe defeating them is not possible, but you might be able to negotiate. There's all kind of reasons for exploring this stuff. So back to Alberti. This guy Alberti is really one of those people that have been he's been ignored. All these the real true Renaissance men, like when you think about Roger Bacon or Andreas Xirtus, we don't really hear about these guys because they were foreshadowed by, like, for example, Alberti da Vinci even though he came after, it was a product of Alberti's work. He doesn't get the recognition he deserves. Now, when you start to get into, like, for example, he says he was a musician. He gets accused of being a not chauvinist, like a show off. He's always telling people, oh, I could jump over a horse, I could throw a coin to the top of all kind of random friggin' things. But what he's doing, I believe, is very cryptic, because all of these things that he's saying that he can do reflect other people. Like, he had multiple code names in history. So, for example, Quetzalcoatl, who was a warrior, he was also known for funding music in the Americas. Like, he was a huge musician. In the Aztec, that culture was big time into music. But there's no trace of Alberti doing anything with music in Europe, but he says he's this big musician. You know what I mean? So I believe these are the kind of correspondences. Back to the Voynich manuscript. When code breakers try to decipher this, they see that it's part of the Nahuatl language, which was the language of the Aztecs, the language of Quetzalcoatl. So there's so many correspondences between Pachacuti, Alberti, and Quetzalcoatl in this Voynich manuscript that I really believe I have discovered the author. And that's why I kind of went right into this, because I think that's one of the most valuable points that I could make in my work is because once you get this, you could say, okay, what was he doing in the Americas? Why was he there? Why did his father get killed? Who were these people? And why is Alberti, Pachacuti, and Quetzalcoatl, how are these guys all, like, quote unquote Renaissance men? How are they all artisans and polymaths? How convenient. So then the whole idea that they were born and died on the same day, that's wild. And then the Pachacuti being into cryptology. I mean, come on, it's too, you can't make this shit up. So moving forward, I believe when the printing press came out, because you got to keep in mind, within like a decade, the printing press, guns, and the nautical sail all came about. And that was a recipe for hyperdiffusionism. And I believe that's how the Italians were able to, these humanists basically seeded every civilization in the 15th century. I mean, it could probably go back to the 13th, 14th, because after all, his father was around. And these people, I believe before the 15th century, the vast majority of the planet was not necessarily in the Stone Age, but we were like hunter-gatherer, Neolithic. We were not behaviorally modern the way that we are right now. The vast majority. There were people, the agencies specifically, that were able to shield themselves, because they understand the punctuated cataclysms that happen in society, and they've been keeping track. They have calendar systems. They have ways of measuring when the next hiccup's going to be, and they capitalize on these events to not only rewrite history, but preserve the human species. And I think when they do rewrite history, it's not always, obviously it's for them to maintain control, and their whole narratives, like, if you notice, almost all religions, they're all like millennial, like they all like have this prophecy of a Messiah, a messianic type of figure. Most of them do. And a lot of them are just like, I'm sorry?
Yes, completely correct. Yes, go on.
Yeah. So, and a lot of them are self-fulfilling prophecies for their own destruction. If you, from the Aztecs to the Inca to the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, I could get into it because it's all subversion. It's all assimilating people from within, and a lot of it points to Rome. For example, the Bible, you get into the Old Testament. The Old Testament reflects a lot of Roman law. And if you actually get into when is the oldest Old Testament printed, when can we actually say this is the oldest version? And it's friggin' like 100 years before the New Testament. And this goes in, and this is like this 100 years before Christ, something like this, give or take. We don't know exactly, but we know it's not too much before that, and it's not too much after that. So we know that the Old Testament and the New Testament, and also one is written in Hebrew, one is written in Greek, and one is written in Hebrew. These are both basically from the same alphabet, which is the Phoenician alphabet. And if you really want to trace the agency, you study the alphabet. It's that simple. I didn't get into this in my last talk, and I really should have, because it's a very simple way. There's a couple breadcrumbs they leave. One is the alphabet, also like obsidian. You could trace the obsidian from Neolithic times until current and see, but let's just get into the alphabet. Like I said, the Old Testament and New Testament are both written in a very similar alphabet in a very similar time. And this alphabet is essentially called Aramaic. Or they are cousins of Aramaic, both of these two scripts. They're written in different scripts. Obviously, one's Greek and one's Hebrew, but they all come from a common source. And when you get into who the Phoenicians were, you say, okay, who are they? They're Canaanites. Okay. Where did the alphabet come from? The alphabet came from Canaanites in Egypt, in the Sinai. They were a lot of people say, no, they're Egyptian hieroglyphs. No, they were Semitic. You can see the values. These were the slaves in Egypt that were workers. We don't know what they were slaves, but they were essentially Hyksos, which were Canaanites in Egypt. Now, this is the oldest alphabet. Obviously, we can get into writing, cuneiform writing, and when we do that, we go back to the Akkadians and the Sumerians. Obviously, Sumerians are a very interesting bunch, by the way, because when you really start getting into the whole thing, you say, okay, who are these Sumerians? What is their language? What is their alphabet? Because every other culture, you can kind of trace the alphabet and see, okay, the Akkadian alphabet slowly turns into the Egyptian Sinai alphabet. You can see how the cuneiform was fused with the vowel, and the Phoenicians did that. Then the Greeks added the vowels, so we have actual words and consonants. You can see but with the Sumerians, and they were allegedly the progenitors now of writing. But where do they come from? What is their language? Where is because it's very difficult. You say, oh, they created the wheel. Okay, they created the wheel, but when you actually get into where the oldest proof of where the wheel is from, it's along the Black Sea region, in Poland and Hungary and various places, nowhere in Babylon. So you say, okay, who are the indigenous people of Canaan and stuff? And as far as the Bible's concerned, it was Hittites. And as far as archaeologically, it's the Makop culture. The Makop culture are Ukrainians. They essentially came down from the Black Sea, because you can even, the Hittite language, you can see it's intrusive to Anatolia. It didn't come from Turkey. The actual Hittite language came from north. So you start to see all of these subversive, even the greatest, the VIPs in the Bible. David's a blonde, Moses is a redhead. You start to say, wait a minute, is this a subversive story that's like predisposing people to believe that a certain people that is not indigenous to this land is supposed to be here because of some kind of divine right? And it seems like this story is perpetuating itself throughout history. Now, the reason I think that is because all history folds in on the 15th century. And yes, there were, in fact, Europeans that did conquer the world. So it's going to reflect this Greco-Roman thing, which when you get into the Greco-Roman thing, you can go back to old Mitanni, Hittite, like I said, the Amorites specifically. When you get into the alphabet, the Hyksos, the Akkadians, it all revolves around this group called the Amorites. And that's who I encourage your viewers to really pursue, because these guys when you think about look at the evolution of math. Go on Wikipedia and see where math comes from. The two oldest actual traces of tangible math. I mean, yeah, we were using tally sticks and blah blah blah, but you get it in Babylon, and you get it in Egypt, and you get it within the time period where the Amorites were controlling Babylon and controlling Egypt. For example, the Rhine Papyrus in Egypt, that was produced under the Hyksos rule. Then when you get into the Plimpton from Babylon, that's an Amorite. That's Hammurabi. Hammurabi was an Amorite. It wasn't Hammurabi, maybe it was Sennacherib. It was one of those Amorite dudes. So these are the oldest remnants of math. Now, like I said, the oldest remnants of the alphabet come from these Amorites, because the Hyksos were Amorites. So you say to yourself, wait a minute, you mean to tell me the alphabet that is their ancestor of all modern alphabets, mostly, even the Mongolian Mandarin, yes, you can trace it. The Indian Sanskrit, and that's what I'm saying. If you wanted to trace the history of the agency, you can trace it through the alphabet. You can see how the alphabet has moved, and you can see, because alphabet, after all, is a form of cryptology. Most people did not read. So the people that was already the first barrier to entry. Am I moving too fast?
No, it's all fine. I'd like to bring up one or two things. So one thing that also David Ewing Jr. spoke about, which I find a highly interesting idea, is that it could well be that much, if not pretty much all of the so-called culture we are aware of from medieval times and also from the Renaissance was basically a privilege for the Starfort dwellers, which would only have been certain royal families along with their servants and a few farmers living inside the Starfort city walls, whereas most people living outside of them would have been something akin, to cannibals, for lack of a better term, in terms of not having language and so on. That's always just important when considering these ideas, because understandably we imagine thinking back and then we imagine, maybe somewhat similar population density on the land, people have a house and clothes and so on. But I don't know if that's like properly validated in history. That's the one thing. And in terms of language, what you had mentioned, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Erhard Landmann. He wrote a book called in German it's called Weltbilderschütterung. He's a German guy initially, I believe. In English, this would be something akin to the shaking of the foundation of your beliefs or of your worldview. And what he has found out is initially he started with, I believe, the Mayan script. So these would be these like pictograms, basically.
Right.
And then he started comparing languages, in this case, with what he would call Old High German, I guess. Mm-hmm. And what he finds is very many interesting correlations. So here we have, for example, German, Old High German, and then Arabic. So for example, here in present-day German, it would be schwarz, which in English means black.
Yeah.
In Althochdeutsch or in Old High German, it would be swart or swart. And in Arabic, it would be aswart. And or even funny one to make a journey, die Reise oder Fahrt in German, a journey. In Old High German, diafari, and in Arabic, it's safari, which is still the word people use, of course, when they go into the jungle. So these are very, very interesting correlations where I would then pose the question, because it is obvious that all these languages you mentioned now, they all do exist. We have scripts, we have books, we have all different types of artifacts which use those scripts. However, my question would be, to what extent could you imagine that this so-called agency at some point could also simply have manufactured quite a few of that languages, maybe even in a quite short period of time, and then only used like a fillet, used different slices of these languages they created and then backdated them to different regions and different times, only to be able to support their present-day mainstream historical narrative? if you
Precisely.
catch my drift. Yeah.
Yeah,
So that's the question, like, how long is this really ago? Or could it have been a few hundred years ago and they just backdated things in many different ways? There's ways to make books look old. There is ways to forge apparently ancient sites. There's even recently quite a few good presentations online which are showing the fraud in much of archaeology.
yeah,
So anything you'd like, because we can of course also stay with the, let's say, mainstream timeline narrative. But for me, and the skepticism I've built up by now, I can't even trust any recent history. And then anything going farther back than, let's say, 150 years becomes amazingly sketchy to me, let's just say.
yeah. And that's the thing. But when you get into how the history just, I was talking about this last week with these guys, with Josh and John, and they were saying from the Arcane Dialogue, you know, I don't really trust anything before recorded sound. Before we started recording sound and before we started recording video, you know, that's all up. We don't really know. It's hearsay. It's all written down. This is all a product of books and the printing press. And then not only that, I don't really believe anything before like 1980s, the night before when we started getting digital and starting when we were able to upload things. That it the potential to screw with that stuff is very high. So yeah, I mean, I'm very skeptical of even take that out of the play. Folding history onto the 15th century is actually a very easy way of understanding history, because let's just say history wasn't fabricated during the Renaissance, and you know, things are chronologically accurate. There is a huge argument for Jungian archetypes and his whole idea of the eternal return and history repeating itself. And the whole idea that history repeats itself is because we are not identifying the patterns. And this, to me, is talking about cryptology and cryptography, rather. So when I'm thinking about pattern recognition, because that's what we are. Humans are pattern recognition machines. We are designed to seek out these things, to know the truth, because you know, it's all about statistics. If you can't, sometimes statistics get thrown on their head. But for example, if 10 people tell you your kitchen's on fire, like I said, there's a chance that your kitchen's on fire. But nowadays, with these bots and stuff with the internet, how are we really going to be able to differentiate what the collective consensus is? Because after all, we're humans. We care obviously about what we think, but it's good to know what the rest of the world thinks to kind of measure how, you know, what's right, you know, what the consensus of good and evil is. Because, you know, that's also a debatable. I mean, granted, like I said, there's gross behavior. You know, there's obviously things that's just a no-no, but sometimes, look, everybody wants to be the winner. You know what I mean? Everybody wants to win, but however, not everyone is willing to compromise their values to do it, and that's something important to.
Well put.
You know?
Yeah, and also I liked your statement earlier, because I always try to approach it in a similar fashion. You mentioned the empathy for the controllers, because ultimately, as much as it appears most of the world stage politicians are nothing but actors, it may well be most of the world-known corporate and other type leaders are simply actors following a certain script and are beholden to those that actually have the funds and the technology and the resources to decide upon anything. But I do think it is very valuable to put oneself into this position of a hypothetical world king, for lack of a better term, and try to understand what is really going on and also what can really be done, because we see all the corruption and all the things going wrong, and I'll be the first to point that out. However, at the same time, if it is true that there really was a quite recent industrial revolution, and even if technology was there before, but that many more people were let into the system and allowed to learn language and culture, to me at least, it puts history in a quite different perspective than if it really were like this, that whatever we would say now, 2000 years ago, people already were highly educated with language and everything else everywhere already, if you catch my drift. So
Yes.
what percentage of the population really only got access to culture recently? We understand it's a double-edged sword, more than double-edged, obviously, but still there are basics like having access to clean running water and things like that, which should, in my mind, be evenly distributed to all. But if it is true that there is only a recent story where many more people were allowed to be let into the system,
Yes.
like I said, it puts me in a different timeline, because otherwise I would just be complaining and be like, oh, we've had all of this for everyone for thousands of years, what's going on? But if it's actually only a few hundred years that a vast majority started to gain access, then it's kind of a different story developmentally, if we look at humanity as a whole.
And exactly. And I totally understand. But I also ask myself, you know, there are still people exhibiting this primitive behavior still. So we still have people essentially in the Stone Age at this very moment. And they either refuse to adapt, or in some cases, they may not be able to because of the culture, the environment. There's many factors that could come into play. So yes, it's a two-way thing. We have to also be honest about things and not just be like, okay, yes, we were probably, yes, okay, we were all in the Stone Age in the 15th century. Now there's an even playing field, because we know that, yes, in the 15th century, not now, yes, now there's pockets of the world that are hunter-gatherers, but listen, in the 15th century, historically, like the mainstream historical narrative, for example, where I'm at now, where I've lived in dozens of countries, like, for example, Jamaica, I lived there for a year and a half. I've been to Angola, different countries that were definitely in the Stone Age in the 15th century. And they were, a lot of them, no, we're not wearing clothes. And like Ewing says, this is a proven fact. So it's not like we have to speculate that people, what Ewing's arguing and what I'm arguing to a certain extent is that, no, that yes, the whole planet was like this. And the agency, who, yes, it seems a European stock, Indo-European stock, did fabricate a Greco-Roman, not just Greco-Roman, because when you, like I said, when you get into who white people are, Europe, because I don't really like getting into race or anything, but ultimately you kind of have to call it for what it is, because when you do talk about the Stone Age in the 15th century, those were Europeans that came into other people's places that weren't white. So like there is an elephant in the room there, and it's not comfortable, and it's you know, I have a sneaking suspicion this is why my you know, I also did not pursue my stuff. Like when I wrote my books, I'm like, you know, I don't really want to pursue this line of thought too much, because I'm like, there is an argument that there is a but no, when you say it, look, it's a proven fact that in the 15th century, Europeans managed to technologically outpace the rest of the world. That's just, and so when they fabricated history in the 15th century, it does look as though there is a European imprint throughout history, is what I'm trying to say. So you can see this in the Middle East, you can see this in China, you can see this in India, and you can see this in the foundations of their civilization. You can see this through the alphabet. If you study the alphabet, you see it. You see, okay, where did the Indo-European languages come from? Where did their words, where did their letters come from? And you say, oh, wait a minute, right after Hittite, which is the oldest one, you got Tocharian, right? Right after, there's a line, you got Sanskrit. Where did Sanskrit come from? A lot of people think India. No, Sanskrit came from Canaan, from modern day Israel, Palestine, call it what you want. The point is, this is the Mitanni. The Mitanni were Indo-Aryans. This is where Hitler got his whole shtick from, because he knew this shit. And he used it to exploit Jewish weakness, quite frankly. And that's my opinion. You know, I mean, but some things are not my opinion. Some things are proven fact.
Yeah, so all that I can think of is, now that you're mentioning tracing it through the alphabet, of course, we would be able to see whether it's an organic evolution or even if parts of it are manufactured. Still, of course, you could be able to see the variations. And this is actually one of the things that is shown in the presentation talking about Erhard Landmann, which I showed just a bit before with these graphs, is that all they do here is they use 2 or 3 very simple rules in terms of switching letters and forwarding letters by one through the alphabet. And if you just do that kind of often enough, you arrive at all kinds of languages. This is actually related to something called the Hexen-Einmaleins, or the witches, let's call it the witches poem by Goethe.
That's very fascinating.
I will quickly
Because
look,
I was
quickly
always
look this
trying
up.
to figure out, how did these guys develop languages in such short periods of time? Because if this was in fact folded over a 100-year period, that's ambitious. And but yeah, something like that, a device like a pneumatic device like that, who knows?
So I'll just point this out to you here for a second, because here I have it. So now I can translate it. Yeah, this is and funnily enough, this page doesn't exist in English, which is a little bit strange to me on Wikipedia now. So here we have it. They call it the witches multiplication table. And yeah, here you have it. You must understand, make 1 into 10 and let the 2 go. And then it goes on like this. Make 3 equal, you'll be rich, lose the 4, make 5 and 6. So the witch says, make 7 and 8 and it's done. And 9 is 1 and 10 is none. And apparently this is also from the work of Mario Pras, who
I love it.
Initially heard this from, but it is also substantiated by what Erhard Landmann had found. But just all aside of that, without any concrete evidence, sometimes I like to use social circumstantial heuristics. What company was arguably one of the most famous and important companies, and maybe still is, and was for the past, let's say, 10 or 15 years? What was its name? What is your first idea?
The past 10 or 15 years, Apple?
Yeah, that's a good one, of course, with the knowledge of good and evil or whatever it would be. Of course, we have BlackRock. We're still the unknown Rupes Nigra. You know, what is the Black Mountain and the Black Rock really? Is it the Masonic Ashlar, or what exactly is going on? But aside from that, which was the company that owned Google, literally called Alphabet? So just to your point.
And also another point is the Hebrew alphabet is called the first 2 letters of the alphabet, which is Aleph, Bet. And those 2 words actually go back. This is a fascinating little thing here. Those 2 words go back God knows how long. And the Hebrew alphabet, which, like I said, is identical to not identical, but very, very similar to the old Amorite, not just Aramaic. The most recent incarnation of modern day Hebrew actually traces its origins before there was many incarnations of this Phoenician script, but it managed to harken back to those Amorites. And you can fit the entire Hebrew alphabet in the in the 6-pointed hexagram. You could actually, and the interesting thing about it is the hexagram was never a Jewish symbol until, I believe it's the 6th or 7th century. And when in Ukraine, it became and the funny part about it is it was a Hindu or Aryan symbol before, and it was often depicted next to the swastika. So I find this very intriguing. Number one, that the Star of David, if you just think about that, like process that information. This is the oldest alphabet we're talking about. The ancestor of all modern alphabets can be fashioned from a 6-pointed star. And this 6-pointed star was not associated with Judaism, and allegedly Judaism is ancient until a stage when there was a bunch of they were called Khazars. It was a Russian horde in Ukraine that was converted to a form of Judaism called Karaite Judaism. This is why it's important when a lot of people blame the Jews for stuff. They're not told, full disclosure, my mother's Jewish. So this is no kind of anti-Semitic friggin' thing, But the Karaite Jews are the culprit. But when I say they're the culprit, they've been the culprit, because this agency weaves in and out of different organizations, religions. You can never really pin it on one people. So that's very important to point out. But throughout history, these Karaite Jews, for example, when you get into what happened with them in the Holocaust or different persecution, they were spared of all. And when you get into where that's where the Star of David comes from these Karaites, not just the Star of David, but if you get into the modern Masorah or the Hebrew Bible as we know it, it was edited by Karaites. And Karaites they're a very small percentage of the Jewish population. And most of them live in Israel. They don't live in anywhere like, I suppose, like the Ashkenazi Jews, for example, who make up the bulk of Jewish people, 80% of Jewish people. They don't follow Karaite. They follow Rabbinic Judaism, which is mainstream Judaism that we all know with the people, with the da-da-da. The Karaites, they don't believe in those laws. They don't believe in any of the laws that the 80% of Jews, yet they're responsible for editing the Jewish Bible. They are the ones that brought the six-pointed star into Judaism and made it. So when you look at this, and they're the ones mostly living in Israel. So you want to, and not only that, their language is all about code copying. It's a literal language built on spy tech, like the whole culture. The culture in and itself is that of a spy culture. When you get into the foundations of Islam and you say, where did that come from? And because Karaite Judaism is also associated with what's called Quranism, or when other religions I
was actually just waiting for that because they seem like to be literalists, scripturalists.
Yes,
Quranism.
exactly. So you understand the Quran too, because I would like, and I went down this line of thought, and we can get into who I believe Muhammad was, and that's a whole other line of thought. But the point is these Karaites, for some reason they're responsible for all that. They come up from the Sadducees, which is the Jews that split from the Pharisees. The Sadducees were the guys that sided with who? Rome. These were the guys that let the Romans come in. Okay, and isn't it ironic that history was remixed by who? The Italians. So, but these Karaites also are, because when you see who are Arabs, when they first originated, they were called the Nabateans. These Nabateans were converted. There's a whole history there. But the point being is they were more Greek and Roman than anything before Islam. They spoke Greek. They spoke Roman. They were not, their culture was super Greco-Roman. Even the Arabic language, if you actually looked in the script, it's heavily influenced by Greek text, Greek script. It's from the Semitic. A lot of people think Arabs are Semites, but no, that's like saying Hispanics are from Spain. No, they were converted to Judaism, and that's where they got the Semitic language, and that's how Arabic was formed, by fusing that with Greek. That's what I'm saying. All of these religions are self-fulfilling prophecies. When you actually study Islam, it actually brings you to Judaism. When you study Judaism, it brings you to Islam. When you study Christianity, it can bring you either way. It depends on your level of intelligence and how you're able to decrypt and basically where you're at with yourself and what side you want to take, what you deem to be. That's a whole other process. But the point is that all of these religions it's like playing a game of Punk'd. Like, for example, nowadays, a lot of Muslims, they probably think Muhammad is like a dark-skinned person, but everything that's written about Muhammad is he's a pale-skinned redhead with black slaves. This is not a woke person. This is not somebody, and the people that he was traveling with, you see what they have to say about minorities. When you talk about white supremacy, I don't want to be too controversial, but you also have to call it for what it is. People are not literate. Even to this day, if people actually read what they would blow their mind. Or if they studied and they'd say, wait a minute, hold on. The Jews too. The Jews aren't exempt from this. I'm not saying everybody's been fucked with. And you really got to understand where it comes from. You got to understand how it all started. And so you could peel the onion and say, oh, this makes sense. Because at any given moment, the agency could pull a lever, that subversive lever, and say, okay, the Mahdi's coming, the Islamic Mahdi's coming, boom. Okay, Mashiach's coming, okay, boom. Every religion had a millennial, in the Aztec, Quetzalcoatl's people, when Hernan Cortez came with the shiny armor. All this stuff was premeditated because they already know when it's time, when that cancel culture, like I said, they play with demographics. They're not stupid. They know. They know that when demographics changes, things change. And they're masters at moving with that and exploiting that. They understand that certain groups reproduce they've been around a long time. They've been documenting humanity for a very long time. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, so one thing I'd like to throw in, which helped me a lot and may make a lot of sense, maybe even to you as well. Again, what I learned from David, the idea that oftentimes when the so-called Jews are being mentioned in ancient or medieval texts, number one, it appears that, at least according to serious and unbiased academic researchers, they cannot properly find the medieval Jews as we would imagine them today, which would, of course, also give then fuel to the idea where people then could, if they believe in that story, rightfully say, oh, the Jews have been expelled from 100 different countries over the ages. However, what I understand, many of the modern day yeshivas were only created in the 1800s. Modern Hebrew is entirely manufactured by Eliza ben Yehuda. And in the old, or what we would deem older scripts, it may well be that when it is referring to a Jew, it actually refers to the Judica, like jurisprudence, law system. So instead of these ancient texts referring to a particular ethnic or religious group, they may simply be referring to the state or the control structure itself. Yes. And that, of course, at least for me, was like, oh, that puts everything in a completely different light. And here we just see whatever it turns out to be correct, but how important it is. Number one, of course, the proper definition of words, understanding of the context of the time, and also understanding, even with the US Constitution, some people have this conspiracy theory, who is meant when they talk about we the people. Well, who is that exactly? And the same thing applies, of course, within any of these religious texts. Who is meant by what word, which also have been changed around 100 times with the Elohim and this and that, 100 million things to speculate about.
We can talk about that, yeah.
But just fundamentally, this idea, and as David reports it, let's say, is that it may also be that many of these medieval and sacred books are nothing but medieval family feud history, whereas you had something akin to bastard royalty or something, which would be Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. And all they did is they had some form of empathy for the common beasts outside the city walls, the Starford cities. And eventually, through a long campaign, which eventually Muhammad succeeded in, through the fall of Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, which was back then the one and only capital city of the medieval world. This is even mainstream history. Yes. And that all these small Starford city dwellers with their one royal family and their entourage maybe went there, once in a lifetime or whatever. But again, all the culture and all the things was mainly within these city walls, and only by breaking the city walls, which may have happened as late as sometimes in the 1800s for some places, or probably in history it would have been, I guess, 1600 something, 1500
Real
something.
Quick, it's also important to note, and I hear you, but speaking of the city walls in Constantinople, those city walls this is when cannons were first introduced. Cannons they existed, but they weren't able to penetrate walls to the extent. Like if you were to put a cannon on top of it, it would crush the entire friggin' castle. My point is, those cannons that Mehmet used, Mehmet the Conqueror, this is historical fact, it was designed by Italians. Like Italians came, Mehmet was a huge patron of the Renaissance. A lot of people don't understand when Mehmet the Conqueror came into Constantinople, it wasn't on some jihadist stuff that we're thinking, right? He was a huge patron of the Renaissance. He had a whole bunch of humanists around him. Humanism can be traced to Alberti. You can trace these things. It's a subversive mechanism, humanism. It's a way to penetrate religion, society, government through different guises. But there's also a lot of beauty in it. Don't get me wrong. But my point with Mehmet is Mehmet was a huge patron of libraries. He was a huge patron of alphabets. He was obsessed with alphabets. He had a bunch of people around him like that were total Renaissance men. So, and his court hated him for that. Mind you, this is a documented thing. Like Mehmet the Conqueror's court, they were like, "What's up with him? Like, he's acting like he's European, and he looked European." Let's face it. That's why when people think that it was like some kind, no, the demographics of Islam then and the demographics of Islam now are completely different. This is why the agency uses certain levers to slow things down and speed things up. That's what I'm trying to tell you. So, and there's this gets into a whole can of worms, but the point being is that, yeah, Mehmet the Conqueror was a total Renaissance man. I believe that Mehmet was a phantom reflection of Alberti. If not, he was definitely in his posse. You know, because Alberti doesn't necessarily, no one ever said he was a redhead. But I think Mehmet the Conqueror was Muhammad, the same Muhammad that's in the you know, because there is a depiction, there's likeness. You know, you're not allowed to depict the Prophet Muhammad in Islam. But if you were to look at the hadiths, you kind of sketch up something that looks similar to this fella right here. So, you know, and his guys too. Ali, all these guys, these were blondes. These were guys that you know. So that's what I'm trying to say is all of these, like the Quetzalcoatl tale, all these tales, even in India, with the people with the horses, with the beards. Beards is another thing. Beards come from who? Europeans. So when you look at the pharaohs in Egypt, indigenous Africans don't have facial hair. That's a product of a Homo sapien Neanderthal hybrid battling the climate and the cold weather. That's how we get that. And you have to be admixed with that to get that. So a lot of people, they you know, I don't want to go down that route. But yeah, so Mehmet the Conqueror, there's definitely some correspondences. Mehmet the Conqueror was a total Renaissance man. He was heavy into the Italian way of life. He was big into humanism. He had a court of humanists around him. And there's no doubt about it, he was part of the agency. And it was the Hegelian dialect, controlled opposition. Because mind you, Alberti's main patron at the time was Pope something the fifth. Oh, how am I forgetting this? But he was the number one. He was the Crusades ended with him. When he died, he wanted to go up against Mehmet, but when he died, they stopped because there was no other pope that was willing to friggin' go against that at the time. But he was going to do it. The point is that he was a huge the Vatican Library, which is the biggest library in the world, was created during the time of Pope Nicholas V. There we go. Pope Nicholas, and he created the Vatican Library with Alberti. The Vatican, as we know it, was built by him with Alberti. So there's a lot of correspondences here. The slave trade, you know, the Atlantic slave trade. That's why when people talk about, you know, circumnavigation and navigating all that happened in the 15th century. You know, that's when I think people were really exposed to other people. And that's why we have this historical narrative that when you really study history, you say, wait a minute, there's been an Indo-European presence throughout the entire planet perpetually since the Kurgan era. When did it stop? When did it end? Yes, you can say, okay, well, all right, Pakistan, maybe, yeah. But like I said, I believe that Islam is a way to, because most of the Pakistani Muslims, when they first founded Pakistan, what were they doing? They were dyeing their hair red. Why were they doing that? Why is that a trend there? Think about it. And who was the indigenous population of Pakistan? You know, yes, we know Alexander the Great came there. There was the Kushan Empire, there was definitely a European. But wait a minute. What about the excuse me, I'm failing right now, but there was many civilizations in India. And even when you can go from the Greeks, even back to the people with the chariots, the Vedas, the Mitanni, there's been many times. And this also happens in China. Hong Kong, the Tocharians. There's been ultimate, like when you look at old Chinese texts, these guys had beards. They were fat. They were light skinned. They didn't look like Xi Jinping. But I think the Chinese know people like
Yeah.
Xi Jinping. They multiply much faster than those fat white bearded dudes. You could pop
Yes.
in five. I'm sorry.
Yes, no, yes, no, you're correct. And I think the idea that the Han Chinese only recently achieved demographic dominance in China or administrational dominance is even mainstream history.
Right.
However, my recurring issue with the whole thing is that we can trace it back, let's say, to 100 years roundabout. What I always find very suspicious, we have the year of 1848. Let's see if it just shows up like this, 1848, which was known as the Wave of Revolutions. So this is one of the points which I find interesting in history, which by now, even this I suspect to be at least partially manufactured and backdated, because you had, here it even should say it, throughout Europe, of course in more than a year. And it says it basically it's the foundation of modern nation states. And what I find so suspicious about this is that you have over 50 countries were affected, but with no significant coordination or cooperation among their respective revolutionaries. Whoever wants to believe that or can possibly believe that, I cannot. And yeah, this is basically many current present-day nation states trace their foundation back to this time. However, if we then consider what I mentioned earlier with the linotype and potential backdating of Civil War newspapers and so on, I'm really wondering how much tangible history we really have. And in reference to the Siege of Vienna or the falling of the Starfort walls, we have, let me see how I find this, maybe even in English. See, it even has a name. I was always confused by this because you learn about this literally in Vienna. You learn about this in primary school of all places, where of course you have no idea what's going on. Why would you ever call something, especially in German, a Linienwahl? This word does not exist in German. You have Mauer, like more, yeah, but you don't say wall, like wall in English. But here you say Wahl, Linienwahl, so the line wall. And this is basically, as you can see here, the Starfort fortification of Vienna. And this was officially only...
The bastion fort?
Exactly, a bastion fort. And this was only removed, as you can see here, around 1870 to 1890 or something. Yeah. And to me, this is just questionable or interesting. And also there is all these, you can find this online about they want to make Vienna a garden city and all of these things. And from what I understand now, many of these walls, for example, in Europe, were only removed after the fall of Constantinople, obviously, because even in mainland history, this would be around 1500. However, then I'm asking, why wait until the late 19th century to properly remove the Starfort wall in Vienna? So this suggests to me that maybe before that it still had a purpose or something, and only around the time of 1870 they really decided and said, all right, we're going to release the technology, we're going to allow more or less open access to the city. Aside from being able to afford to live anywhere, it's even just a question, are you allowed to go in? At least in common medieval depictions, the city is always guarded and you're not allowed to go in. So what did it have a function? Presumably. And then why was this function only turned obsolete for Vienna as late as around 1870? For me, all alarm bells start ringing, because I'm like, well, were there still whatever cannibals around before that, wild animals?
And you know what's interesting too is this is right before we started recording sound. We started recording sound, if I'm not mistaken, I believe, I want to say 1905, but sound and then video, little video started to, flickers of video started to rear. So this could have been, yes, this is the time of Francis Bacon, Antonius Kircher, the German Rosicrucians, who heavily influenced the Nazis. There's a line here, and there it goes to like, yeah, you can't, but you can't really be like, okay, the agencies, the Nazis. No, they used the Nazis during that time. You know, they used the German people. It's not there now. You can't. That's why getting into demonizing people is part of their play. That's what they want, because by the time you're demonizing a certain culture, or you're saying, okay, it's the Illuminati, they've already moved on, and those people are scapegoats. You know.
Precisely. Yes.
It's funny, but it's actually not. It's not funny. But yeah, man. And let's get back to Mehmed real quick, because Mehmed's an interesting character. That whole time, when you also get into Vlad the Impaler, you know, and his relationship with Mehmed, his brother's relationship with Mehmed, with Radu. Radu lived with Mehmed. That was like his adopted brother. Mehmed's father essentially kidnapped Vlad and his brother when they were young. Not necessarily kidnapped, but made an exchange with his father. It was like a power play. It was a show of submission. And they're all tied into this. And you understand, Transylvania, number one, is the only Latin country bordering the Black Sea. And the Black Sea, I believe, is the stomping grounds of this agency. They're perpetually in history, you see, whether it's the Goths, the Huns, the Vandals, you're always seeing it's north of the Black Sea. So I can't say exactly where it could, who knows how north we go. But we do know that when a mammal goes north, and it gets, the higher we go with our altitude and the colder that we are, the longer we stay in that environment, you know, over generations, our brain size does grow. And there are factors that could predispose people in the upper northern hemispheres to have an upper hand on the people on the lower hemispheres. We have to acknowledge these facts. So when we say, yes, okay, everyone was in the Stone Age in the 15th century, fine, but we can still accept human evolution. So we don't repeat the same patterns, because I think this is what's part of their play. Cancel culture. I think the whole reason that we have to dig and speculate about the Indo-European presence in India and in China is the reason why these patterns are perpetuating themselves, because people hide them. They, instead of admitting to, like, for example, I'm in Colombia. It's a known fact that there's an Indo-European, like my wife looks like an Indian, but she's talking in a Spanish language. It's a proven fact that you know what I mean? It's accepted. It's not like something that's shunned. I'm totally safe here, for example. You understand? My culture is compatible with them. It's one of those. So my point is that it's important to yes, when we speculate on these theories, yes. Anyway, let's get back to Mehmed and Vlad, because there's definitely a tale to tell, and what I believe happened was, it's a tale of reverse controlled opposition. So what they're doing, the agency is doing, is it's leveraging people's beliefs and their nationality, because they know that people cling on to these things and they're willing to die for it. And you can possess people this way. And you know, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with nationality and culture, borders, language, culture. I get it. However, it's important to understand how these things can be used to exploit us, so we can at least prevent that from happening. Yeah, so Vlad, all of these guys are all battling for the throne of Rome. Mehmed called himself Caesar of Rome, the king of Rome, the emperor of Rome. Everyone wanted to be the new emperor. Then Vlad wanted it because he escaped the clutches of Mehmed. His brother stayed with Mehmed, but he left and he started his own friggin' thing, with his father, because his father was named the Dragon. And when I get into who Alberti's father was, I believe it was Quetzalcoatl, which is the feathered serpent, because you see this feathered serpent motif show up all over the place, whether it's the serpent grabbing the eagle in the Aztec mythology and their foundational myth, whether it's a Pepe in Egypt. There's a bunch of things we can go down that whole route. But the real thing, I really want to stick to Mehmed in the fall of Constantinople, because what happened was, it's interesting. We think, okay, the fall of Rome happened in the 15th century. But at the same time that Rome, which is Italy, I mean, Rome was Constantinople at the time, but generally speaking, the people, the Roman people, all of a sudden, they conquer the rest of the world. So, okay, Rome falls, but hold on. You see Columbus and all these Latin people, Portuguese, Spaniards, they're all of a sudden, now all of a sudden the vast majority of the planet is speaking Spanish. Before that, Arabic was a huge, but even right now to this day, there's more people speaking Spanish than there are Arabic. So, and this was a product of that whole time when Constantinople fell. The plague. Allegedly, the Europeans were escaping the plague, and that's what brought them to the Americas. I beg to differ, because Alberti gave Tuscanelli the map that he gave to Columbus. And how did he get that map? Because he was, in fact, a Mesoamerican himself. This is what I mean. And his father was a Norman. I believe Quetzalcoatl was a Norman, or Viking, whatever you want to call it. He, there's many ways. He was a seafaring person. Yeah. So when Constantinople fell, that flushed in all that Greek knowledge into Florence. So all of a sudden, Florence has control of the historical narrative. This is conveniently the same time the printing press is invented. So now you can mass produce. That's why I believe Mehmet was a part of this. These guys, Vlad, all of these guys orchestrated this simultaneously in order to produce this. So that's what I'm saying. Like when Ewing talks about America is controlled by Muslims, that's a lever that eventually, when the threshold reaches, if it does, and Islam, then all of a sudden the wool is pulled over, and the Europeans are like, wait a minute, yeah, your prophet's one of us, kind of thing. Oh yeah, it's perfectly acceptable for us to join this. In fact, hey, Islam's been a Western religion all along. Gotcha. You know what I mean? It's one of those, and it keeps happening. It's one of those things, is because they understand the demographics reaches a threshold, and that's part. And cancel culture seeps in. That's when you start having people chip away the noses of sculptures and put different color paint on statues. And that's been going on for a very long time. We see this right now with Netflix and shit. But that whole mentality has been around for a long time, and I believe the agency uses this as a gauge to know when it's time for a reset. This is what the Bible says when God floods the earth. I think it's the same methodology. But I do think the flood actually happened, because you can trace this flood back 5,000 years along the Black Sea. There was a huge deluge 5,000 years ago in the Black Sea. And this is the whole region of Spy Central. I think this is where what Joseph Campbell calls the monomyth comes from, because all of a sudden you see this flood myth. There is no other myth that has a higher spread than the flood, because this trickles down to almost every society. And why is it? How convenient is it? There's a Renaissance man that symbolizes rebirth and the regrowth. He's the hero's journey, they say. It's convenient.
Convenient it is. So again, according to David, it may well be that even if it is a family feud with warring faction internally, they would both be interested to either present the Caliph to the world, which would be something akin to the world king, or the Moshiach, which equally would be equivalent to a world king. And that all that they're doing, at the very least for the last 100 years, where there appears to be sort of a standstill after this massive destruction of the First and Second World War, which I would say to this day is still kind of unknown, how much destruction of culture and so on that really has caused.
Right.
But that since then, every generation, basically, that's why we hear about it again and again, different factions try to nominate different individuals to become the world leader. However, since they are even internally fighting at the elite level, they can't really agree, let's say, on a common candidate. And that's why every generation, this is a recurring theme, and of course also conveniently couched within different scriptures or interpretations of scriptures, so that ultimately many major religions, at least with Christianity and Islam, would have this idea of the second coming of Christ. And then, of course, here we can interpret it also in New Age ways or a spiritual consciousness way. But just as a practical method, I always have to think of Dune. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Dune series.
No.
And the Dune is by now very famous with the new
I've
movies.
been meaning to get into that. I tried once and it seems so slow, but I should take my time with it because I
Yes,
heard
what is easier to get into? So two things I can recommend. One is a mini series called Children of Dune from the 2000s. Also
okay.
the very old I think it's a David Lynch movie, I want to
Oh,
say
I
for
love
some
David
reason.
Lynch movies, man. Eraserhead.
Because I think he made the original Dune. It was kind of like not as many people wanted, but it's still interesting to watch. And also to get into it more easily, there is a recent series now called Dune Prophecy, where they also mention many things. And I cannot shake the suspicion, if it is not already confirmed, that also Frank Herbert in this very famous science fiction series incorporated quite a few elements of real history in a somewhat encoded way. Just to give one example, there is a a space empire run by the Padishah Emperor. It's all about one particular planet, but
Uh-huh.
you have these noble houses fighting each other. This may remind one maybe of the old Ottoman Empire with an overarching emperor who has all the armies and so on.
Sure.
But what you also have in the background, you have a religious order that do something akin to genetic matchmaking in order to bring around the Kwisatz Haderach or the Moshiach. And what is this order called? They are called the Bene Gesserit, or you could just call them the Jesuits, right?
Yeah.
So there's many correlations here.
Huh.
I think you would enjoy it. And one more thing I
Yeah.
would like to show
Definitely
you
check that
briefly.
out.
This is from an organization called the Internal Predictor of the USSR, which is also related to a book called The Master and the Margarita, which I haven't read, but have heard great ravings about it, for which I don't want to lie right now, but there is one particular book where Fomenko even made the image for. It may have even been The Master and the Margarita. That there's a cat image and it's actually drawn by Fomenko. But anyways, that's quite an interesting group
It's
based
also
in.
something to highlight is the first printed version of the Quran. It was Paganino Paganini in Venice. It was in Italian. Just a point of information.
Yes, very good. And what they have here, so this is from a, I guess, Soviet perspective or Eastern perspective, a long-term strategy to overcome Quranic Islam by biblical project wheeler dealers. And what this is simply a juxtaposition between, so how can we resolve the problem of Islam for the West, and at the same time, how to resolve, how should I say, the lies and obfuscation of the West with the Bible. Okay, so this is actually from 2010. I'll make sure to send this to you. It is quite interesting because you rarely have a bird's eye view of looking at these religions and kind of predicting, because here
Yeah,
they also state, well, we
it's
know
wild.
one side wants a global caliphate. We also know the biblical guys are lying. And how
It's
can
like
this actually
social
be resolved?
architecture.
And that's quite
Sure.
interesting to ever read something public that appears to be quite, I want to say, a high level
Yeah,
thought
huh?
document that may have some validity to it.
Very cool. Very cool. So yeah, man, I think with that whole 15th century soup, like I said, guns, the plague. The plague killed a lot more people than we think. I mean, and I think our population was a lot less than we think. So these punctuated plagues, they use this. This goes back to Julian Jaynes. Because look, one thing Fomenko, or I don't even know if Ewing, like they're Julian Jaynes really puts this whole thing into perspective, because when you fuse his line of thought, this philosopher Julian Jaynes, is important your viewers actually look into this, because he claims that behavioral modernity as we know it happened in the Bronze Age. Now, if you couple that with Fomenko saying, Bronze Age history is a fabrication of the 13th and 15th century, you start to put in this whole, yes, we could have been in this schizophrenic, zombie-like state prior to the Renaissance, and it was actually literacy. This is what I think is what brought us out of this schizophrenic, what Julian Jaynes calls bicameral state, which is two hemispheres. That's what we were basically talking to ourselves, and we used religions and stuff, and we were looking at our dead relatives. This is how ancestor worship, and this is how the foundations of religion, because we were looking at our plague-ridden relatives like they were still alive and they were, dead or dying. It gets really morbid. But the point is, with Julian Jaynes, no one's really been able to debunk him. If you, I've been like, okay, where's the argument against it? Because I always try to look for that when I'm studying something, especially if it's something that makes sense to me. I'm like, okay, who's debunked this, and what's their how can I steel man this? And I can't do it with this. So this is one of those things. You hit one of those, and it confirms Anatoly Fomenko's thing. But he never gives you an actual reason. And Julian Jaynes, when you combine it, it's like a math equation. You put this together, you're like, oh, the history kind of, okay. Because if you look at all script before the Bronze Age, like the old Akkadian stuff or Sumerian stuff or, any of this, old Mitanni Vedas, these things, even though the Vedas actually, when you really look at when it was printed, it was definitely after the Bronze Age. But my point being is there's no real theory of mind. It's like we're being controlled by these entities, we're not thinking for ourselves. That whole, even when, perspective, when Alberti introduced perspective into his manuscripts and started teaching this at the Florentine Academy, this is when artists started drawing realistic faces. Before that, things looked very, it's clearly there was an upgrade, and so, yeah, there's definitely something going on in that 15th century, and Mehmet the Conqueror, Vlad the Impaler, and not only that, John Hunyadi in Hungary and his son Matthias Corvinus. These are all guys that were heavily involved with this whole, because these guys are all alive in the same time. Because you can it's easy to go back in history and superimpose characters over 15th century people. Right now, we're talking about actual 15th century spies. Okay, now when you talk about who John Hunyadi was, John Hunyadi, he accused of killing Vlad? No. Who did he kill? And John Hunyadi. He was considered Christ's champion by Pius's, by Alberti's main patron. Okay, now these guys all studied this. If you look at him and Vlad, they were both considered voivodes of Transylvania. They both, exactly. There's the ties between these guys. You're like, hold up. How did he kill him when they were both standing for the same thing? So what this tells me is, no, he faked his death and basically reintroduced himself as this person. And this has been done multiple times. This is why I think the Renaissance man has multiple. However, I don't want to spread him too thin. He's only one man. And then we're only talking about 80, 90 years. So for all intent and purposes, Vlad, Hunyadi are different people in the same agency. So they're basically operating as a super organism. They're functioning as one entity, but it's multiple people. Or it could be, in fact, one person. Alberti was known for wearing wigs. The whole idea of the French wearing wigs and then the British started, that came from Alberti. Alberti was the first guy to wear that whole getup, which is really interesting. And then when you think about the classic Washington, D.C., or how buildings came about, what we consider tasteful buildings, this is all a product of Alberti's style, but he never really built anything. This is what's really interesting. You can trace it back to him because it's almost like he buried himself. He encrypted this Alberti figure because, after all, his real name is not Alberti. Alberti is a cipher. It's him, but it's a name. It's a name that you can actually, if you can decrypt it and be like, wait a minute, hold on. Everything that we know, from the modern day computer to the camera, this is all spy tech. The internet, where is the modern day surveillance and spy? It all deals with internet, it cameras and record. Before, you had to have people on every street watching everything. Now all you got to do is put it. Where do you get this technology from? Alberti and his optics. Not necessarily Alberti. Listen, you could also go back to Al-Kindi, the Arabs who got their information from the Greeks, and the Greeks got it from the Babylonians. There's a friggin' line But that goes back to Amorites. That goes if you study the alphabet, it's all the same people. They're all using the same structure, the same gods, recycled, renamed. There's a lot of calling cards. For example, the storm god, the thunder god, killing the dragon. You see this multiple times, and this is a little bit. Look, I understand a flood. Okay, you could say, okay, yeah, floods happen all the time, but a storm god and a dragon, that's a little bit, that's a combination. Those are three separate things, three separate motifs. That how is it possible that places from different parts of the entire world have the same motif? So yeah. No, I mean.
Yeah, great points. To me, of course, what is incredibly difficult, and as I mentioned earlier in history, we can discern a pattern. And as you said, there is something to be said about archetypes and recurring themes. That seems to be a real thing. However, since it is so difficult to look past a certain threshold in history, it then becomes unclear to what extent these are real events in history or when it was originated from, like, for example, the Renaissance. And could it be that certain things and cultures were then simply backdated according to the same pattern, right?
Yes.
Either to give credence to what they did then. I mean, there is examples, maybe even you showed them, between different supposedly biblical times or Greek philosophers, and then 1,000 years later, you have the very similar name, similar face, similar things in the Renaissance.
I think their MO is? I don't mean to cut you off, Raphael.
Please.
I think their MO is they test things. Like, for example, there wasn't money or metals, smelting of metals or things introduced into Central and South America. They were seeing what worked. And also, for example, when they made it seem like some cultures are ancient, Egypt, for example, ancient, Babylon, ancient. But if you look at the historical narrative of Mesoamerica, where I'm at right now, you see the Aztecs, the Inca, okay, yeah, you see Mayans, Olmec. But if you actually think about real civilization, like it's Aztecs and Incas, and these are products of the 15th century. A lot of people, when they think of Aztecs and Incas, they think it's ancient. But no, this is historically, this is not speculation. So the point is that what I'm trying to make is what happened when the Europeans came and mated with the Native American, the Mesoamericans. You created Hispanics. This is a new people. This is a literal new culture. They're not native. They're not European. They're testing things. And so what I'm thinking is what they're doing. This is a hybrid culture that their past has been removed. If they really want to start studying their past, they can't pound their chest and be like, hey, look, I had an alphabet thousands of years ago, or I was friggin' riding horses. No, they have to, they're humble by default. So they have to, I think the agency is basically testing this new breed and seeing, okay, how are they going to build their what are they going to do with the knowledge they have? But because this is a deadly thought. This is why I don't like getting into race. When you think that your race is superior, you're fucking wrong, man. Because every race has strengths and weaknesses. Yeah, you can say intelligence isn't everything. Like when I say, yes, the altitude, the climate, the cold. No, when you think about just sheer numbers, Africans, their population skyrocketing. Europeans and Chinese people, we're not having babies. And it depends on what is your measurement of power? What is your measurement of success as a human? Because if you measure it based on the other animals, what is that? It's reproduction. So you can play this game of who's and also look, if you've ever been to jail and black people, they handle things differently. They don't get depressed in the same way. So obviously there's admixture and stuff, but you can see people handle things differently, especially me. If you've been exposed to a lot of different people in your life and coming about it from a good place and objective, yes, there's differences, but it's beautiful. Variety is the spice of life, and you have to appreciate it. And I do believe, yes, the agency also exploits it. and understands the strengths and the weaknesses. And okay, you can put these people here. There's going to be, because multiculturalism, listen, it's not, diversity is not everybody's strength. We have to understand certain things. Like in certain contexts, it's not. You have to call it for what it is. I understand it's good to be empathy and love people, absolutely, 100%. But you have to be honest with yourself and with life. And that's how you solve things, because if you want to solve problems, it requires trust. And the only way you're going to get trust is through honesty, you know? And then I don't want to, I'm veering off here, but.
No, it's a great point. Just like you said, there is great strength in diversity, and it's both ends. Just like you said, it's all obviously one common species, or however you would call it. At the same time, you obviously have different propensities. This may be to an extent cultural, this may be epigenetic over several generations.
Right.
Yeah, I was just thinking, because the one not so contentious example to use is the Japanese. You know, the question is, are they doing so well with not allowing in so many foreigners? You know, it remains to be seen. But what I actually want to say is, the real question is then, when you take into account language and culture and upbringing, what actually creates a stable societal system? Just like you said, it may well be that they're probably every nation state today is an experiment in some way.
Yeah.
But like you said, I wasn't actually aware of that in Mesoamerica, individuals do not have this ancient nationalistic or cultural claim.
No.
I'm only aware that they had, I almost don't want to say the word, starts with Geno and ends with side, but that so many people actually
no. This is the thing. This is
died.
Important to highlight, especially coming from me, because I've lived in many different countries. And like, I'm in a city right now in Colombia. I'm not in Medellin or Bogota. I'm in the Andes. I'm in a place where I'm in a city with tens of thousands of people, but I'm probably the only white guy. This is a place where you don't even really see too many people with beards, you know, compared to, I mean, you do see them. Obviously, there's admixture, but it's compared to the United States or Europe, forget it. The point is that they love white people. They love us. Honestly, when you're a nice guy, you don't fucking come across like they associate us with, this person has something good. I know this might sound bad this is how it really is in black countries, and look, and this goes both ways. This is like being an exotic animal in nature. The predators are also going to be looking at you. Don't get me wrong. But this is you have to accept that. When I understand, yes, I'm exotic here. And yes, people look at me, oh, look, it's a gringo. But at the same time, they're like, oh, it's a gringo. Great. This is a sign of civilization, quite frankly. This is a sign of prosperity. So, like, and it's not, there's nothing wrong with saying that. This is the thing. We feel as though this is something taboo. But no, we have to acknowledge and be a people. We are a people that are working, like you said, we are all part of the same family. And it's important as white people to acknowledge, if in fact we are on the tip of the evolutionary spear, so to speak, and we do have an upper hand, and I'm not saying we do, because I already explained to you that we all have strengths and weaknesses. But if in fact that is true, it's our responsibility to care for everybody else. You know what I'm saying?
Precisely, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And even if
Yes. And even if it is just a point of language and culture and certain sciences where we understand academia can also go a completely wrong way, but even just having the basics of culture and infrastructure would put us, and I would pretty much include every Westerner in this, who has the blessing to think about more than his immediate survival. The next thing would be exactly this responsibility of how to create stable social systems, first of all in your own country, because you're in the West, it doesn't look so good right now.
Exactly.
But the same thing, of course, for everyone else, how to uplift all the places, because I'm pretty sure even any migrant issues they are supposedly screaming about in America and Europe would very quickly be solved if, instead of having all this obfuscation through history, which then allows people to believe that they want to enlist in a war, together, of course, with medical scams and other things that bring people into poverty and then again enlist them to be shredded in wars. But if all of that were revealed, we could cease with that and instead use the resources available, not for money and
Yes.
security or weapons and security, but for infrastructure. And I'm pretty certain 90% of immigrants anywhere would most gladly go back home if their
Yes.
country is not freshly bombed or whatever else,
Well,
or under
we also
threat.
have to, yes, I agree with this, but I also understand sometimes it's not only about throwing money at a problem, because you could measure these things in the United States. You can see that, yes, there's a line there. There's a balance that has to be reached, because it's not all environment. You know, when you really get to the nuts and bolts of it, because genes also create the environment. Yeah, there's a huge genetic component, but also when you think about it, and yes, environment, climate, all these things play a huge factor in one's quality of life. But we tame nature. Humans we are a product of controlling nature. You know, we are yeah. I mean, I don't know where I'm going with that, but
Well, what we can do in any case. So thank you so much for that. Very off the cuff tour through history, and you brought quite a few great examples. I think I tried to show a few of them also on screen. However, briefly for this last section, only for tonight, because 100% certain as soon as possible we'll have you back together with Andreas, and he'll be able to hone into anything in particular you say, because honestly, although I have very rudimentary understanding, because I understand there's so much obfuscation, I honestly didn't even consciously try to catalog all of these things. I mean, I'm starting with certain key points, but if we understand how much is obfuscated, it's almost difficult. Like, what can you really touch? What is really makes sense to research so deeply?
yes,
I mean, it does make sense in the end,
yes.
but I am very happy to have individuals like you to talk to that have more advanced knowledge in this
Same.
or have studied it in more depth, because then you can get interconnections, just like with sacred texts, which are ideas you would never get by just reading the standard translation or the standard transmission that is given by the system, right? Which usually leads you nowhere, anywhere. And I know you mentioned that you wrote your books before the advent of AI, but you were also plowing through all the wiki and other sources to correlate these things. So maybe just so we find some final point only for today, kindly talk a little bit about your book and explain somewhat, because as I understand, it is a fictionalized account,
Yes.
but it's connecting many of these ideas. So just so we do some promotion, at least, again, everyone, you find the links in the description, also to the book. Talk a little bit about it so people can get curious and maybe they want to get it also as a foray, maybe even to start thinking in this more interconnected fashion, let's say, because you're drawing from many real world examples, as I understand.
And that's what it's all about. This is not about making money. Granted, if you'd like to support me, my books are available, but they're also available for free on my website, which is my name.com, michaelanthonyalberta.com. Now, I'm not sure how long they're going to stay free for, but for the time being, they will be. And the audiobook, too, is also available for free. And my last book before this, too, which we can get into, but that's enough. Anyway, I'd also like to talk, by the way, Raphael, with Ewing. Ewing seems very knowledgeable, and there's a lot of I agree with him on a lot of things. He very fascinating individual. I should probably reach out to him on my own. But the point, in terms of the Renaissance Man, the book, this book was written over about a 5-year period, but it really took about 10 years because I was studying the information for a long time. And I was very hesitant to go down because I didn't want to, the whole idea of conspiracies, and I started seeing conspiracies and everything. And I was like, no, I wanted to, and also, I basically put it on ice for a while. And now I'm revisiting it. Like, I wrote this book 3 years ago. And I started traveling. I started learning, I started learning Spanish. Different projects came up. But now I'm like, no, this is important. This is an important, the information that even though it's considered a fictional novel because I wasn't there, obviously. And listen, it's all hearsay. It's all based on Wikipedia. There's a formula. It's me revisiting the same Wikipedia links over a 5-year period, seeing the information that sticks, seeing the correspondences, using a Google Doc. And what you do is if you press Control F on a Google Doc, there's a find feature where you can type in certain words. So I'll put in certain dates, and I'll see where these dates. And as I'm stacking up this information and building this narrative, I'm seeing where these dates are tagging. So I'm like, oh, the Bronze Age collapse, the Hyksos expulsion, the Chinese alphabet, all these things. It's convenient, all happening at the same time. You start to put together. There's a fractal that starts to emerge after you do this and I did come to the conclusion that yes, you can kind of measure anything and start to find correspondences, and it's, and this goes to the phi ratio and the Fibonacci sequence and pi and mathematics, which I get into in the book. But ultimately, it's a way to question. This book was written so people could question the historical narrative. It's not a saying this is what happened. This is just me finding a bunch of correspondences and associations with a subject that has been intriguing me, specifically sacred geometry, the alphabet, and it makes in the occult. I've been studying the occult and all this stuff for a long time, but privately, just in my spare time, trying to but I started realizing, no, this is spy tech. It makes total sense, because you get into the Renaissance men after, they are known spies. John Dee, Edward Kelly, Francis Bacon, and these are people that are. It's a proven fact. And then when you get into modern day spy agencies like the Five Eyes, which I spoke about in my last interview, that they are a modern day manifestation. Because if you look at the Voynich manuscript, that's how they all came together, is studying and trying to decrypt this. And I have a feeling this Voynich manuscript is a way to indoctrinate potential spies into the agency. If you're able to decipher what it says, and there's levels to it, I have a feeling that there's many layers, and depending on how far down you can go down there, you'll get into that. And not only that, if you look at the Five Eyes spy network, if it's not the Voynich manuscript, it's the Enigma machine, because the US, UK, and English Anglophone nations came together to fight the Nazis. And what they did was Alan Turing figured out how to decrypt the Enigma machine. The Enigma machine, like I said earlier, is an electric form of the polyalphabetic cipher, which is an invention of Alberti. Which is why he's attributed to being the father of cryptology, because of this Alberti cipher. And the Enigma machine, again, is the precursor to the modern computer. His book, his manuscript, El Le Pictura, shows the precursors to optics that leads to the camera. There's a lot of other things, like I said, perspective, language. There's many things that are in the historical facts about Alberti that I really want to point out. Because, and not just Alberti, Nezahualcóyotl, Pachacuti, let's just say hypothetically, they're not all the same person, even though, look, there's a couple things that I speculate about on the book, but I'm pretty sure that Alberti, Pachacuti, and Nezahualcóyotl are the same person, and I'm friggin' pretty sure that they authored the Voynich manuscript. And yes, it has to do with what we would consider espionage. So yeah, I mean, I can keep going, and like you'll have me back on, but it's late by you and it's early by me, so I'll let you get some rest. Raphael, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure, man.
Thank you very, very much. Everyone, again, check out the links in the description. The book is called The Renaissance Man: Portrait of a Spymaster by Michael Anthony Alberta. To everybody who wants to check it out, I also linked the last interview you did for anyone who maybe wants a maybe somewhat more controlled introduction than what we did today, although I greatly enjoyed it. Thank you so much for pointing out all these details. And as I said, we will make sure to come back with Andreas as soon as possible. And I'm sure you'll have another, blast of a discussion in the most positive sense. And maybe we can, pin down even more details or simply make even more interesting connections. And also, certainly, please do reach out to David Ewing Jr.
Yes.
And also, I'll make sure to tell him. So at the very least, you have a conversation, maybe even something we can record. But even if not, at the very least, to get some, just to share perspectives. And, there's always something new to learn.
I know that the two of us, there's definitely things we don't agree on. That's kind of why it's always good. Those are the kind of people I like to have discussions with, because they, I'm open. Listen, if I'm presented with new information, I will change my beliefs. It's very important to think critically in this world.
Yes, a rare and very, very important ability. So good on you and good on all of us if we're able to. Yes, we do what we can, or we do what we must. Everyone can decide for themselves. So once again, I'll thank you very much, and I'll send us out with a track, and we'll be talking again very, very soon together with Andreas. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thanks, so long, guys.